The heart monitor's steady beeping was the only sound in. Operating room 7 as I watched my own pulse flatline on the screen. 3 years of planning had led to this moment. My wife Rebecca stood behind the observation glass, tears streaming down her face as she watched what she believed was my death. But here's what she didn't know. I was very much alive. And this was just the beginning of the most elaborate revenge in medical history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, 6 months earlier, I had discovered Rebecca's affair with Dr. Marcus Chen, the chief of cardiology at Seattle Metropolitan Hospital. While I was pulling 18-hour shifts as a surgical resident, barely scraping by on my meager salary, she was falling into the arms of a man who drove a Tesla and owned a penthouse overlooking Puget Sound. But that night in the operating room, as the machines declared me dead and Rebecca sobbed into Marcus's shoulder, I smiled beneath my surgical mask. Because in 3 years, when Rebecca would need emergency heart surgery after a massive cardiac event, I would be the only surgeon qualified to save her life. My name is David Coleman, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was a third-year surgical resident at Seattle Metropolitan Hospital, married to Rebecca Williams, a beautiful pharmaceutical sales representative who I'd met during my first year of medical school. We lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, sharing dreams of the future when my residency would end, and we could finally start our real life together. Rebecca was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. She was intelligent, ambitious, and understood the demanding nature of medical training. During my most exhausting rotations, she would wait up for me with dinner, listen to my frustrations about difficult surgeries, and remind me that our sacrifices would eventually pay off. She even helped me study for my boards, quizzing me on surgical procedures while I practiced sutures on pig intestines at our kitchen table. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a rainy Thursday evening in March. I had just finished a particularly brutal day in the cardiac surgery unit, where I'd assisted Dr. Marcus Chen in a complex aortic valve replacement. The surgery had gone well, but I was exhausted from being on my feet for 12 hours straight. All I wanted was to collapse on our couch with Rebecca and maybe watch something mindless on Netflix. When I opened the door to our apartment, I was surprised to find it empty. Rebecca's purse wasn't by the entrance. Her shoes weren't scattered near the closet. The usual smell of whatever takeout she'd ordered for dinner was nowhere to be found. I called her name, thinking maybe she was in the bedroom or bathroom, but silence greeted me. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her cheerful recorded message echoed through our empty living room, and I left what I thought was a casual message asking where she was and if she wanted me to pick up dinner for both of us. 20 minutes passed, then an hour. I tried calling again, this time getting voicemail immediately. I wasn't particularly worried yet. Rebecca often had late client dinners or company events that could run longer than expected. Her job selling cardiovascular devices to hospitals meant she frequently worked with doctors and hospital administrators, often entertaining them at expensive restaurants I couldn't afford on my resident's salary. At 9:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Sorry, honey, got caught up with a client dinner. Going to be really late. Don't wait up for me. Love you." The message seemed normal enough, but something about it felt off. Rebecca usually called when her plans changed, and she always told me which restaurant she was going to and roughly when she'd be home. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I checked her location on Find My Friends. We'd set it up months ago when she'd gotten lost driving to a client meeting in Tacoma, but I'd never actually used it to track her movements. The little blue dot showing Rebecca's location made my stomach drop. She wasn't at any restaurant. She was at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel downtown. I stared at the screen for several minutes, trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe the client dinner was at the hotel restaurant. Maybe it was a pharmaceutical company event in one of their conference rooms. Maybe her phone's GPS was malfunctioning. But even as I told myself these things, a cold dread was settling in my chest. The next morning, Rebecca was already gone when I woke up. She'd left a note on the bathroom mirror saying she had an early meeting and would see me that evening. Her side of the bed looked barely slept in, the sheets still tucked and smooth. When I kissed her goodbye that evening, she smiled at me with the same warmth she always had. But I found myself studying her face for signs of deception. Following weeks, I became hyper-aware of every detail of Rebecca's behavior. She started working later more frequently, often not coming home until after 10 o'clock. Her phone, which used to sit casually on counters and tables, was now always face down and within arm's reach. She began taking calls in the bathroom or stepping outside to the balcony, claiming they were work calls that required privacy. Pharmaceutical industry did involve a lot of confidential discussions, and Rebecca had always been professional about not sharing details of her negotiations with hospitals. But now every private conversation felt suspicious. When I asked about her day, her answers became vague and rehearsed. Just the usual client stuff, she'd say. Or you know how it is, trying to hit my quarterly numbers. The breaking point came on a Friday night in April. I'd gotten off early from my shift. It's a rare occurrence that I'd been looking forward to all week. I wanted to surprise Rebecca with dinner from her favorite Thai restaurant and maybe convince her to stay in and watch a movie together. We'd barely spent quality time together in weeks, between my demanding schedule and her increasingly frequent work obligations. I arrived home with bags of pad thai and green curry, expecting to find Rebecca getting ready for what I assumed would be another late work event. Instead, I found her sitting on our couch, fully dressed in the black cocktail dress I'd bought her for my hospital's holiday party. She was applying lipstick using her phone's camera, and she looked stunning. "Wow, you look incredible," I said, setting the takeout bags on the kitchen counter. "Big client dinner tonight?" Rebecca looked up, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, guilt, maybe even fear. But it was gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Oh, David, you're home early," she said, standing up and smoothing down her dress. "Yes, it's a really important dinner. We're trying to close a big deal with Swedish Medical Center, and the whole cardiology department is going to be there." Something about the way she said cardiology department made my pulse quicken. I knew that Dr. Marcus Chen was the chief of cardiology at Swedish Medical Center. I also knew that he was divorced, wealthy, and had a reputation among the residents for being a bit too friendly with the attractive pharmaceutical reps who visited our hospital. "That sounds promising," I said, forcing my voice to stay casual. "Which restaurant are you going to? Maybe I can swing by after my shift tomorrow and say hi." Rebecca's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. "Oh, it's just a boring place downtown. You wouldn't like it. Besides, it'll probably run really late, and you need your sleep." She kissed me quickly on the cheek, grabbed her purse, and headed for the door. "Don't wait up for me, okay? This could go until midnight, or later." After she left, I sat in our apartment surrounded by the smell of Thai food I no longer had any appetite for. I pulled up Find My Friends again and watched as Rebecca's location moved through downtown Seattle. She stopped at Il Terrazzo Carmine, one of the most expensive Italian restaurants in the city, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance, and where a single bottle of wine could cost more than I made in a day. I spent the rest of that night staring at my phone, watching her location remain stationary at the restaurant until nearly 11 o'clock. Then the blue dot moved to the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, the same place it had been several weeks earlier. This time it stayed there until morning. As I completed my final months in Houston, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that both Rebecca and Marcus were facing the natural consequences of their actions, but this was still just the beginning. The skills I'd learned and the connections I'd made during my time at the Institute were about to become weapons in the next phase of my plan. 2 years after leaving Seattle, I returned as Dr. David Coleman, board-certified cardiovascular surgeon with credentials that made me one of the most sought-after heart surgeons on the West Coast. The transformation was complete in every way that mattered. Gone was the exhausted, financially struggling resident who had discovered his wife's betrayal. In his place stood a confident, wealthy, and professionally respected surgeon who could write his own ticket at any major medical center in the country. I'd received job offers from hospitals in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Phoenix, and Denver. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All of them offered substantial signing bonuses, equity partnerships, and the kind of compensation packages that would have seemed impossible during my residency. But I chose to return to Seattle, specifically to Swedish Medical Center, the same hospital where Marcus had once been chief of cardiology. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was taking a position at the hospital where Rebecca had been conducting her affair while still married to me. Swedish Medical Center had recruited me aggressively, offering me the newly created position of Director of Advanced Cardiac Surgery, along with a salary that was more than Marcus had been making before his forced resignation. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, Swedish Medical Center's chief of staff, personally flew to Houston to convince me to join their team. "David, your reputation precedes you," she told me over dinner at one of Houston's finest restaurants. "Your success rate with complex valve repairs is unprecedented for someone your age. We want to build our cardiac program around surgeons like you." What Dr. Hoffman didn't mention, but what I knew from my research, was that Swedish Medical Center had been struggling to rebuild their cardiac surgery program after the scandal surrounding Marcus's departure. His forced resignation had created both a leadership vacuum and a reputation problem that had cost them referrals and prestige within the medical community. I accepted their offer with the understanding that I would have complete autonomy over my cases and the authority to establish new protocols for the cardiac surgery department. I also negotiated for the right to take emergency cases from other hospitals when Swedish Medical Center's facilities were better equipped to handle complex procedures. My first day back in Seattle was surreal. The city looked the same, but I was seeing it through completely different eyes. Instead of taking the bus from my old apartment in Capitol Hill, I was driving a new BMW from my downtown penthouse to my private office in one of the city's most prestigious medical buildings. I had deliberately chosen not to research Rebecca's current situation before returning to Seattle. I wanted to encounter whatever her life had become naturally, without preconceptions or expectations. I didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks into my tenure at Swedish Medical Center, I was reviewing patient files when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Dr. Coleman, we have an emergency case being transferred from Harborview. The patient is a 32-year-old woman who suffered a massive heart attack during a routine medical procedure. They're requesting you specifically because of your expertise with emergency valve repairs." I looked up from the surgical schedule I'd been reviewing. What kind of routine procedure was she having? My assistant checked her notes. Cosmetic surgery. She was having breast augmentation when she went into cardiac arrest. The plastic surgeon thinks she may have had an undiagnosed congenital heart defect that was exacerbated by the anesthesia. I nodded, already mentally preparing for what would likely be a complex emergency surgery. "When will she arrive?" "The ambulance is en route now. She should be here within 10 minutes. Made my way to the emergency department, reviewing the preliminary information that had been transmitted from Harborview. The patient's name was listed as Rebecca Chen, and something about that name combination made my pulse quicken. Chen was Marcus's last name, and Rebecca was obviously a common enough name that it could be a coincidence. But as I reviewed the patient's age and insurance information, I realized that coincidences of this magnitude didn't exist. My ex-wife, who had divorced me to be with Marcus Chen, had apparently married him and was now being rushed to my hospital in critical condition. After a heart attack during cosmetic surgery, the ambulance arrived with sirens blaring. I watched from the emergency department doorway as the paramedics rushed the patient into Trauma Bay 3. Even unconscious and connected to multiple monitoring devices, I recognized Rebecca immediately. She looked older than her 32 years, with the kind of stress lines around her eyes that suggested her life hadn't turned out exactly as she'd planned. The attending emergency physician, Dr. James Park, briefed me quickly on Rebecca's condition. "She's stable for now, but barely. The echocardiogram shows severe mitral valve dysfunction, and there's evidence of a septal defect that was probably congenital, but never diagnosed. She needs surgery immediately, or she won't survive the next few hours." I approached Rebecca's bedside, studying the monitors that displayed her vital signs and cardiac rhythm. She was unconscious, maintained on a ventilator and completely vulnerable. For a moment, I was transported back to that night 3 years earlier when I'd discovered her affair, when I'd felt powerless and betrayed and humiliated. Now the situation was completely reversed. Rebecca's life was literally in my hands, and I was the only surgeon in the region with the specific expertise needed to repair the combination of defects that were threatening to kill her. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Dr. Park was waiting for my assessment. "Can you save her?" he asked. I continued studying Rebecca's charts and monitor readings, taking my time to fully evaluate the complexity of her condition. The surgery would be challenging, but not impossible. The mitral valve repair could be accomplished through minimally invasive techniques, and the septal defect, while significant, was operable. With my current skill level and experience, I estimated an 85% chance of complete success. "Yes," I said finally, "I can save her, but she'll need to be prepped for surgery immediately." As the nursing staff began preparing Rebecca for the operating room, I retreated to my office to call Marcus. I wanted him to know exactly who would be performing the surgery that would save his wife's life. Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety. "This is Dr. Chen."
Marcus.
"This is Dr. David Coleman at Swedish Medical Center. Your wife Rebecca is here and she needs emergency cardiac surgery." There was a long pause. "David, what are you doing at Swedish Medical Center?" "I'm the director of advanced cardiac surgery," I said. "Right now I'm the only surgeon in Seattle who can perform the procedure your wife needs to survive." Another pause. Longer this time. "There has to be another surgeon who can do it. I'll pay for her to be transferred to any hospital in the country." "There isn't time," I said truthfully. "Rebecca needs surgery within the next 2 hours, or she'll die. Any attempt to transfer her to another facility would be fatal." I could hear Marcus breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. It was a fair question, and one that I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd recognized Rebecca on the gurney. I had every reason to let her die. She had betrayed me, destroyed our marriage, and caused me years of pain and humiliation. Marcus had abused his position to steal my wife and had tried to destroy my career when I'd posed a threat to his relationship. But as I sat in my office, looking out at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized that my revenge had already been complete. Rebecca had married Marcus, only to discover that he was a disgraced former department chief. With a tarnished reputation and limited career prospects, she'd traded a future with a successful surgeon for a present with a man whose best days were behind him. Meanwhile, I had become everything she'd wanted in a partner: successful, wealthy, respected, and powerful. The life she could have had with me was now mine alone, and she would spend the rest of her days knowing what she'd given up. "I'm going to save her life," I told Marcus, "because I'm a doctor, and because I took an oath to do no harm. But I want you to understand something clearly. When Rebecca wakes up, she owes her continued existence to the man she betrayed. Every day for the rest of her life, she'll know that she's alive because I chose to be a better person than she ever was." The line went quiet for so long that I thought Marcus might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," I replied. "Just make sure Rebecca understands exactly who saved her life when she wakes up." I hung up the phone and began preparing for the most important surgery of my career, not because of its technical difficulty, but because of what it represented. This was my chance to prove that I had moved beyond the pain and anger that had driven me for so long. This was my chance to demonstrate that my success wasn't about revenge, but about becoming the best version of myself possible. In for surgery, I thought about the man I'd been 3 years earlier: broken, humiliated, and powerless. That man would have wanted Rebecca to die on the operating table. But the man I'd become understood that the ultimate victory wasn't in destroying my enemies, but in rising so far above them that their opinions and actions became irrelevant. Rebecca's surgery would be flawless. She would recover completely and go on to live a full life. And every morning when she woke up next to Marcus, in whatever modest home they could afford on his reduced income, she would remember that her life had been saved by the man she'd thought wasn't good enough for her ambitions. The surgery took 4 hours and went exactly as I'd planned. Rebecca's mitral valve repair was textbook perfect, and the septal defect closure was accomplished with minimal complications. As I sutured the final layers of her chest cavity, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with professional satisfaction. When Rebecca woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit 12 hours later, I was reviewing her postoperative reports at the nurse's station. Through the glass walls of her room, I could see Marcus sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and speaking quietly to her. His relief was obvious, but so was something else. The recognition that this moment had fundamentally changed the dynamic between all three of us forever. I waited until Rebecca was fully alert and oriented before entering her room. Marcus saw me approaching and stood up, his face a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Rebecca looked up at me with confusion at first, then recognition, then something that might have been shame. "Hello, Rebecca," I said, checking her monitors and reviewing her chart with professional detachment. "How are you feeling, David?" she said, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. "What are you doing here?" "I'm your surgeon," I said simply. "You had a massive heart attack during cosmetic surgery and you needed emergency cardiac repair. You had a congenital mitral valve defect and a septal defect that had never been diagnosed." Rebecca stared at me, processing the implications of what I'd just told her. "You operated on me?" "Yes, the surgery was successful. You should make a complete recovery, though you'll need to be on cardiac medications for the rest of your life and have regular follow-up appointments." Marcus cleared his throat. "David, I want you to know how grateful we are. I know this situation is complicated, but you saved Rebecca's life." I looked at Marcus, noting how much he'd aged in the 3 years since I'd last seen him. His hair was significantly grayer, his face more lined, and his posture suggested the weight of professional disappointment. "It's not complicated at all," I said. "I'm a cardiac surgeon, and Rebecca needed cardiac surgery. It's what I do." Rebecca was still staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "David, I don't understand. You're a cardiac surgeon now. But you were just a resident when we divorced? Finished?" "Yes, I was. I completed my residency, then did an 18-month fellowship at the Cardiovascular Surgery Institute in Houston. I'm now the director of advanced cardiac surgery here at Swedish Medical Center." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Rebecca had left me partly because she wanted to be with someone who was already established and successful. Someone who could provide the lifestyle she desired immediately, rather than eventually. Now I had become that person, while Marcus had lost his position and prestige. "I had no idea," Rebecca said quietly. "There's no reason you would have," I replied. "We haven't exactly been keeping in touch." Spent the next few minutes going over Rebecca's recovery plan and discharge instructions, maintaining the same professional demeanor I would use with any patient. I explained her medication regimen, activity restrictions, and the timeline for her return to normal functioning. Throughout the conversation, both Rebecca and Marcus remained subdued, clearly struggling with the surreal nature of the situation. As I prepared to leave, Rebecca called my name. "David, wait. I need to say something." I turned back to face her, waiting. "I owe you my life," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "And I know that makes this situation incredibly awkward. For all of us. But I need you to know that I'm grateful. Whatever happened between us in the past, what you did today, was extraordinary. You don't owe me anything," I said. "I did my job. Any surgeon would have done the same thing." "But it wasn't just any surgeon," Rebecca said. "It was you. And given our history, you would have been justified in refusing the case or transferring me to another doctor." I considered her words for a moment. "Becca, I became a doctor to save lives, not to settle personal scores. It's what happened between us was painful, but it doesn't change my obligation to help people when they need medical care." "I know I hurt you," Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made terrible choices. I handled our divorce badly. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Dr. Martinez, the head of surgical education, called me into her office with news that would change everything. The hospital had received a grant to send one resident to the prestigious Cardiovascular Surgery Institute in Houston for advanced training. The program was 18 months long and would essentially fast-track my career, putting me years ahead of my peers. In terms of experience and credentials, "David, your performance has been exceptional," Dr. Martinez said, sliding a thick packet of paperwork across her desk. "The selection committee unanimously agreed that you're our strongest candidate. However, I need to know if you're interested. The program starts in 6 weeks, and it would mean relocating to Texas for a year and a half." I stared at the documents, my mind racing. 6 weeks ago, this opportunity would have been complicated because of Rebecca. I would have needed to discuss it with her, figure out if her job could transfer, consider the impact on our relationship. Now, with what I knew about her affair, this felt like a gift from the universe. "I'm definitely interested," I told Dr. Martinez. "When do you need an answer?" "Take the week to think it over and discuss it with your wife. The paperwork needs to be submitted by Friday." I left her office with the application materials tucked under my arm. But I had no intention of discussing anything with Rebecca. Instead, I had a different plan forming in my mind. Over the next week, I would document everything I could about her affair. I would gather evidence not just for my own peace of mind, but for the divorce proceedings that would inevitably follow. That evening, I told Rebecca about the Houston opportunity over dinner. Her reaction was telling. Instead of the excitement or concern I might have expected, she seemed almost relieved. "Wow, Houston," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "With studied casualness, that's really far away. 18 months is a long time." "I know it's a big decision," I said, watching her face carefully. "What do you think?" Rebecca took a sip of wine, and I noticed her hand was trembling slightly. "I think you should do what's best for your career, David. You've worked so hard for this. But what about us? What about your job here?" She looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw something that looked like guilt flash across her features. "We'll figure it out. Maybe the distance could be good for us. It'll help us appreciate what we have." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. She was essentially giving me permission to leave, probably because it would make it easier for her to continue her affair without having to sneak around. I nodded and told her I'd think about it, but inside I was already making plans. The next few days became an intensive investigation. I started by creating a detailed timeline of Rebecca's suspicious behavior, noting dates, times, and circumstances of her late nights and changed patterns. I screenshotted her location data from Find My Friends whenever she claimed to be at work. Events but was actually at hotels or expensive restaurants. I also began paying closer attention to her digital footprint. Rebecca had always been active on social media, but lately, she'd been more selective about what she posted. Her Instagram stories, which used to include casual shots of her daily life, now seemed carefully curated to avoid any mention of evening activities or weekend plans. The breakthrough came when I noticed her laptop was still logged into her personal email account. Rebecca had always been trusting with her passwords, and we'd shared devices casually throughout our relationship. I told myself I was just borrowing her laptop to check my own email when mine was charging, but really, I was looking for evidence. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Buried in her sent folder were months of emails to Marcus Chen. The early messages were professional, discussing product demonstrations and pricing for cardiac devices. But as I scrolled through the chronological progression, the tone became increasingly personal. By February, Marcus was inviting Rebecca to private consultations at his office. By March, they were exchanging messages about weekend getaways and intimate dinners. The most recent email sent just 2 days earlier made my stomach turn. Rebecca had written to Marcus about her excitement for their upcoming romantic weekend in Vancouver, how she was tired of hiding their feelings. I screenshotted everything, uploading the evidence to a secure cloud storage account that Rebecca didn't know about. Then I dug deeper, finding credit card statements that showed charges at jewelry stores, lingerie, boutiques, and high-end hotels, on days when Rebecca had claimed to be visiting clients or attending work conferences. The most damning evidence came from her text message backup. Rebecca's phone automatically synced to her laptop, and I was able to access months of conversations between her and Marcus. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for almost 6 months. They talked about their future together, about Marcus's divorce settlement, and about how Rebecca planned to leave me once my residency was over and I was more financially stable. In one particularly cruel exchange, Marcus had asked Rebecca if she felt guilty about the affair. Her response was burned into my memory. "David is so focused on his career that he barely notices I exist. He'll be fine. Besides, he's not exactly husband material for someone with my ambitions." Reading those words felt like being punched in the chest. I'd been working 80-hour days, sacrificing my health and social life, believing I was building a future for both of us. Meanwhile, Rebecca saw my dedication as neglect and my financial limitations as a character flaw. The final piece of evidence came from Marcus's social media accounts. He was more discreet than Rebecca, but I noticed that his recent posts from medical conferences and professional events often included subtle glimpses of Rebecca in the background. A hand holding a wine glass that matched her nail polish, reflection in a restaurant window that showed her distinctive silhouette. I got a photo from a medical conference in San Francisco that I knew Rebecca had attended for work, despite having no legitimate business reason to be there. I spent hours cross-referencing their social media activity, finding a pattern of coordinated posts and synchronized travel that painted a clear picture of their relationship. They were careful, but not careful enough. Every work trip Rebecca had taken in the past 3 months corresponded with Marcus's travel schedule. Every late night she'd blamed on client dinners coincided with Marcus posting photos from expensive restaurants. By Thursday of that week, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier of their affair. Photos, emails, text messages, credit card statements, travel records, and social media evidence that would make any divorce attorney salivate. But more importantly, I had a plan. I accepted the position in Houston and began making arrangements to leave Seattle. I told Rebecca that the program was starting sooner than expected and that I would need to relocate within 2 weeks. Her relief was obvious, though she tried to hide it behind expressions of concern and support. During my final week at Seattle Metropolitan Hospital, I made it a point to observe Marcus and Rebecca's interactions during her sales visits. Now that I knew what to look for, their affair was glaringly obvious. The way Marcus lingered during their professional conversations, the way Rebecca's entire demeanor changed when he was around. The knowing glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. I also used my remaining time to gather intelligence about Marcus's reputation. Within the hospital, it didn't take long to discover that I wasn't the first resident whose relationship had been disrupted by Marcus's advances. He had a pattern of pursuing younger women in vulnerable positions, using his status and wealth to seduce pharmaceutical reps, nurses, and even medical students. Dr. Sarah Kim, cardiothoracic surgery fellow, confided in me during a late-night conversation in the residence lounge. "Marcus Chen is a predator," she said bluntly. "He's been doing this for years. The hospital administration knows about it, but he brings in too much revenue for them to care." "Has anyone ever filed a complaint?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "Who's going to report the chief of cardiology? The women he targets are usually in positions where they can't afford to make enemies, and the hospital would rather look the other way than deal with the scandal." This information gave me another layer to my plan. Marcus wasn't just stealing my wife. He was a serial manipulator who had hurt other women with impunity. Taking him down would serve a greater purpose than just personal revenge. On my last day at the hospital, I made copies of Marcus's personnel file, including previous complaints that had been buried and incident reports that had been minimized. I also documented his inappropriate use of hospital resources for personal entertaining and his pattern of showing favoritism to pharmaceutical companies. Based on his personal relationships with their representatives, as I packed my belongings from my tiny residence office, I felt a strange sense of peace. Rebecca thought she was getting rid of an obstacle to her new life with Marcus. Marcus thought he had successfully eliminated a potential complication. Neither of them realized that they had just given me the motivation and freedom I needed to destroy them both. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would spend 18 months in Houston not just learning advanced surgical techniques, but also building the credentials and connections I would need for what came next. I would return to Seattle as a board-certified cardiovascular surgeon, qualified to work at any major hospital in the country. And when the time was right, I would make sure that both Rebecca and Marcus paid for their betrayal in ways they never saw coming. Houston proved to be exactly what I needed. The Cardiovascular Surgery Institute was renowned for producing the most skilled heart surgeons in the country. The 18-month program was intensive beyond anything I'd experienced during my residency. I threw myself into the work with single-minded determination, channeling my anger and betrayal into surgical precision and academic excellence. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the Institute's director, took notice of my dedication early on. "David, I've been doing this for 25 years, she told me after I'd successfully completed a particularly challenging valve replacement procedure. "I've never seen a resident with your combination of technical skill and emotional control. You have the makings of a truly exceptional surgeon." Her words meant more to me than she could have known. While Rebecca was building her new life with Marcus in Seattle, I was becoming someone entirely different. Someone stronger, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous to those who had wronged me. I maintained minimal contact with Rebecca during my time in Houston. Our communications were limited to brief text messages and occasional phone calls that felt increasingly forced and artificial. She would ask about my training, and I would give generic responses about being busy and learning. A lot. She would update me about her job, carefully avoiding any mention of her social life or evening activities. 3 months into my Houston program, Rebecca called with news that should have surprised me but didn't. "David, I've been doing a lot of thinking about us," she said, her voice carefully modulated in a way that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation. "I think we need to have an honest discussion about our relationship." I was sitting in my apartment near the medical center, reviewing surgical notes for the next day's procedures. I set down my papers and gave Rebecca my full attention, curious to see how she would handle what was obviously going to be a breakup conversation. "I'm listening," I said simply. "We've been growing apart for a while now," Rebecca continued. "Even before you left for Houston, we were more like roommates than husband and wife. And with you being so far away for such a long time, I think we need to seriously consider whether this marriage is working for either of us." The irony was breathtaking. Rebecca was framing our relationship problems as mutual issues, when in reality she had been systematically destroying our marriage through her affair with Marcus. She was presenting herself as someone who had come to a difficult realization about our compatibility, rather than someone who had been cheating for months. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. There was a long pause. "I think it might be best for both of us. We're still young, and we want different things. You're so focused on your career, and I need someone who can be more present in a relationship." I almost laughed out loud. Rebecca was actually blaming our marriage problems on my dedication to my medical training. Same training that was going to make me wealthy enough to provide the lifestyle she claimed to want. She was rewriting history to make herself the victim of my ambition rather than the perpetrator of infidelity. "I see," I said. "And you've thought this through completely?" "Yes," Rebecca said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. She thought I was going to make this easy for her. "I think we should file for divorce as soon as possible. Since we don't have children or significant shared assets, it should be straightforward." "What about the apartment?" I asked. "I'll handle the lease termination. I'm actually thinking about moving anyway. Maybe getting a place downtown, closer to my work, closer to Marcus's penthouse, more likely." I wondered if she had already moved some of her belongings to his place, or if they were waiting until our divorce was final to make their relationship public. "All right, Rebecca," I said. "If that's what you want, I won't fight it. I'll have a lawyer contact you about the paperwork." The conversation ended with Rebecca expressing gratitude for my maturity in handling the situation and wishes for my continued success in Houston. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that the charade was finally over, satisfaction that my plan was progressing exactly as I'd anticipated, and a cold determination to see it through to the end. I hired a divorce attorney the next day, but not just any attorney. Through my research, I'd identified the most aggressive family law firm in Seattle, one with a reputation for thorough investigations and scorched earth tactics. I provided them with every piece of evidence I'd gathered about Rebecca's affair, along with detailed financial records showing how she'd used our joint accounts to fund her relationship with Marcus. The divorce papers were served to Rebecca at her office, too. Weeks later, according to my attorney, she was shocked by the level of detail included in the filing. We weren't just seeking a simple no-fault divorce. We were alleging adultery, breach of fiduciary duty, and emotional distress. The papers included photographs, email excerpts, and financial evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of her deception. Rebecca called me that evening, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely panicked. "David, what is this?" she demanded. "Why are you making this so complicated? We agreed to keep things simple." "I never agreed to anything," I said calmly. "You announced that you wanted a divorce, and I said I wouldn't fight it. That doesn't mean I'm going to pretend our marriage ended for mutual reasons when you've been having an affair for months." "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Rebecca, I have emails. I have photographs. I have credit card statements showing purchases at jewelry stores and hotels on days when you claim to be working. I have text messages between you and Marcus Chen discussing your romantic weekend in Vancouver. Do you really want to continue lying to me?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for almost a minute. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was different. Carefully controlled tone was gone, replaced by something harder and more defensive. "Fine," she said. "Yes, I've been seeing Marcus. But it's not what you think. Our marriage was already over, David. You were never home, never present, never available. Marcus gives me the attention and support that you never could. So it's my fault that you cheated," I asked. "It's not that simple," Rebecca said. "You chose your career over our relationship every single time. You chose 18-hour shifts over dinner with your wife. You chose studying over spending time together. Marcus understands what it means to be in a partnership." I found her rationalization fascinating from a psychological perspective. I thought had completely reframed the narrative in her mind, casting herself as the victim of my neglect rather than the perpetrator of betrayal. She genuinely seemed to believe that my dedication to my medical training justified her affair. "Tell me about Marcus's understanding of partnership," I said. "Does he understand it well enough to leave his wife for you? Or are you just one in a long line of pharmaceutical reps he's entertained, while maintaining his real life separately?"
Another
Long silence. "Marcus and I are planning a future together," Rebecca said finally. "A future that apparently couldn't wait until you were divorced to begin." "David, I'm sorry it happened this way," Rebecca said, and for a moment sounded like the woman I'd fallen in love with years earlier. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't pretend to be happy in a marriage that wasn't working." "Marriage could have worked if you'd been honest about your needs instead of lying and cheating," I said. "But you made your choice, and now you get to live with the consequences." "What consequences?" Rebecca asked, and I could hear the fear creeping back into her voice. "The divorce will be public record," I said. "Your affair with a married doctor will be documented in legal filings. Your professional reputation in the pharmaceutical industry might suffer when your clients learn about your methods of closing deals. And Marcus's position at the hospital might become untenable when the administration learns about his pattern of inappropriate relationships with vendors." "Can't do that," Rebecca said. "You'll destroy both of our careers." "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm simply ensuring that the truth comes to light. You and Marcus created this situation when you decided to have an affair. I'm just making sure there are appropriate consequences for your actions." The conversation ended, with Rebecca threatening to fight the divorce and accusing me of vindictive behavior. I expected nothing less. What she didn't realize was that I'd only shown her a fraction of the evidence I'd gathered, and that the divorce proceedings were just the opening move in a much larger game. Over the following weeks, I watched from Houston as my attorneys systematically dismantled Rebecca's attempts to minimize the affair or shift blame for our marriage's failure. Every lie she told in her depositions was contradicted by documented evidence. Every attempt she made to portray herself as a victim was countered by her own emails and text messages. Marcus tried to distance himself from the proceedings, claiming that his relationship with Rebecca was purely professional and that any personal involvement had begun only after our separation. But the timeline I'd documented told a different story. and his own communications proved that he'd been actively pursuing Rebecca while she was still married and living with me. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, with Rebecca receiving only her personal belongings and half of our minimal shared assets. The adultery finding meant she wasn't entitled to any spousal support, and the detailed documentation of her deception made it impossible for her to claim she deserved any compensation for supporting my medical career. But the real consequences were just beginning. Word of the scandal had spread through Seattle's medical community, and Marcus found himself facing a professional conduct review at the hospital. Several other pharmaceutical reps came forward with their own stories of inappropriate advances and quid pro quo arrangements. The hospital administration, faced with potential liability issues, quietly asked Marcus to resign his position. Rebecca's career suffered as well. The pharmaceutical industry was smaller than people realized, and news of her affair with a client Dr. made other hospitals reluctant to work with her. She was transferred to a different territory covering smaller hospitals in rural areas, with a significant reduction in her earning potential. As I completed my final months in Houston, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that both Rebecca and Marcus were facing the natural consequences of their actions. But this was still just the beginning. The skills I'd learned and the connections I'd made during my time at the Institute were about to become weapons in the next phase of my plan. "I know I hurt you," Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made terrible choices, and I handled our divorce badly. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the confident woman who had betrayed me, but someone who appeared genuinely humbled by her circumstances. "Rebecca, what's done is done." We both moved on with our lives. Today was about medicine, not about our past. Marcus stood up, extending his hand toward me. "David, regardless of everything that happened before, thank you for saving my wife's life. I know we didn't part on good terms, and I take responsibility for my role in that." I shook his hand briefly, noting the contrast between his current position and the arrogant department chief he'd once been. Like I told Rebecca, I did what any doctor would do. Over the following days, as Rebecca recovered in the hospital, I made routine rounds to check on her progress. Each visit was professionally appropriate, but emotionally charged. The nursing staff had no idea of our history, treating these interactions as normal doctor-patient consultations. But the weight of our shared past hung in the air during every conversation about her recovery. Rebecca's physical healing progressed normally, but I could see that she was struggling with the psychological impact of her situation. During one of my visits, she asked the question I'd been expecting. "David, can I ask you something personal?" I looked up from her chart. "You can ask, are you married now? Do you have a family?" "No," I said simply. "I've been focused on my career because of what I did to you." I considered how to answer that question honestly. Partly, but also becoming the surgeon I am now required complete dedication. I chose to prioritize my professional development over personal relationships. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I used to think you were too focused on your career, that you didn't make enough time for us. Now, I understand that your focus was building something meaningful, something lasting." I couldn't see past the immediate sacrifices to the bigger picture. "People grow and change," I said. "We were both very young when we got married, but you were building towards something," Rebecca said. "It was just existing, looking for shortcuts to a life I thought I deserved without earning it." The honesty in her admission caught me off guard. The Rebecca I'd been married to would never have acknowledged her own shortcomings so directly. "What happened after our divorce?" I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, staring out the hospital window at the Seattle skyline. "Marcus and I got married 6 months after our divorce was finalized. For a while, it seemed like everything I'd wanted. He had money, status, a beautiful home. But after he lost his position at Seattle Metropolitan, things changed." "How so?" He became bitter, angry about his career being destroyed, as he put it. He blamed the hospital administration. He blamed you for filing the complaint that started the investigation. He blamed the other women who came forward with their stories. He never accepted responsibility for his own actions. I found this predictable but didn't comment. Rebecca continued. His reputation in the medical community was ruined. He couldn't get hired at any major hospital. He eventually found work at a small community hospital in Spokane, but it was a significant step down in prestige and pay. We had to sell the penthouse, downsize our lifestyle completely. That must have been difficult, I said, and I meant it without sarcasm. But more than the financial changes, it was watching Marcus become someone I didn't recognize. He was consumed with resentment and constantly talked about how unfair his situation was. Started drinking more, became emotionally distant. The man I'd left you for essentially disappeared. Rebecca paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I realized now that I was attracted to Marcus's success more than to Marcus himself. When that success was gone, there wasn't much left of our relationship. We stayed married, but we weren't really partners anymore. Sorry to hear that, I said, and I was surprised to find that I genuinely meant it. The irony is that I convinced myself I was leaving you for someone more ambitious, more successful. But Marcus's ambition was really just entitlement, and his success was built on taking advantage of people in vulnerable positions. When that was exposed, he had nothing left to offer. I nodded, but didn't offer any commentary on her marriage. It wasn't my place to analyze her relationship choices. And I'd learned enough about Rebecca's current situation to understand that my revenge had been more complete than I'd ever imagined. Can I ask you something now? I said, of course. The cosmetic surgery you were having when this happened, is that something you wanted or something Marcus wanted? Rebecca's face flushed slightly. Marcus had become very critical of my appearance as I got older. He made comments about women he worked with, pharmaceutical reps who were younger than me. He suggested that some procedures might help me maintain a more youthful look. The picture this painted of Marcus was even more disturbing than I'd expected. The confident, successful man Rebecca had chosen over me had apparently become insecure and controlling, projecting his own failures onto his wife's appearance. I'm sorry you felt pressured into that, I said. The worst part is that the surgery wasn't even necessary. The plastic surgeon said my heart defect could have been triggered by any major stress on my system. A serious illness, an accident even. Extreme emotional trauma could have caused the same result. I risked my life for a procedure I didn't even want. Over the remainder of Rebecca's hospital stay, our conversations became more natural, though still bounded by appropriate professional limits. She asked about my time in Houston, and I told her about the challenging cases I'd worked on, and the skills I'd developed. She shared more details about her life in Spokane, painting a picture of a marriage that had become a source of disappointment rather than fulfillment. On the day of Rebecca's discharge, Marcus arrived to take her home. He looked uncomfortable throughout the discharge process, clearly aware that the dynamic between the three of us had shifted permanently. I went over Rebecca's follow-up care. Instructions, emphasizing the importance of cardiac rehabilitation and regular monitoring. Dr. Coleman, Marcus said as they prepared to leave. I want you to know that I've thought a lot about what happened 3 years ago. I was wrong to pursue Rebecca while she was married, and I was wrong to try to intimidate you afterward. My ego and my sense of entitlement drive me to make decisions that hurt a lot of people. I looked at him, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know that I understand my role in all of this. Rebecca stood beside him, using a walker as she slowly regained her strength. David, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Not just the surgery, but the way you've treated us with dignity, despite everything that happened. Take care of yourself, I said. Follow up with your cardiologist in Spokane, and don't hesitate to call if you have any concerns about your recovery. As they left the hospital, I watched from my office window as Marcus helped Rebecca into their modest sedan. It was a far cry from the luxury lifestyle they'd once enjoyed. But there was something peaceful about the way they moved together, as if they'd both accepted their current circumstances. 6 months later, I received a letter from Rebecca. She wrote to update me on her recovery, which had been excellent, and to share some news about her life. She and Marcus had divorced amicably, both acknowledging that their marriage had been built on the wrong foundation. Rebecca had moved back to Seattle and was working for a nonprofit organization that provided medical devices to underserved communities. Marcus had entered therapy to address his behavioral patterns and was volunteering at a free clinic while working part-time at the community hospital. I wanted you to know that saving my life gave me the chance to rebuild it in a way that actually has meaning, Rebecca wrote. I wasted so many years chasing the wrong things, but your example showed me what it looks like to dedicate yourself to something genuinely important. I'll never be able to repay you for giving me that opportunity. I kept the letter in my desk drawer, reading it occasionally when I needed a reminder that people could change and that forgiveness, even when not explicitly offered, could still heal wounds. A year later, I was invited to speak at a medical conference about advanced cardiac surgery techniques. During the reception, I was approached by Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who had recruited me to Swedish Medical Center. "David, I have to tell you something," she said. "We knew about your history with Rebecca Chen when we hired you. I was surprised by this admission you did. When Marcus Chen was forced to resign from Seattle Metropolitan, we did our due diligence before offering you the position. We learned about the circumstances of your divorce and the investigation that led to Marcus's departure. We wanted to make sure you could handle working in Seattle again, given the potential for awkward encounters. And what did you conclude?" Dr. Hoffman smiled. "That you were exactly the kind of person we wanted leading our cardiac surgery program. Someone who had faced personal adversity with dignity and had used it as motivation to excel professionally rather than become bitter or vengeful." "I don't know about that," I said. "I think I had my share of bitter moments." "Maybe so, but you channeled them productively. And when the moment came to prove who you really were, when Rebecca's life was in your hands, you showed that your character had grown beyond your pain."
Oh.
As I drove home that evening through the streets of Seattle, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years earlier, I had been a broken man whose life had been shattered by betrayal. Tonight, I was a successful surgeon with a thriving career and the respect of my peers. Revenge I'd planned had been unnecessary. Rebecca and Marcus had faced the natural consequences of their choices without any additional intervention from me. Marcus had lost his career and reputation through his own pattern of inappropriate behavior. Rebecca had discovered that the successful man she'd chosen was actually insecure and controlling when his external validation was removed. Meanwhile, I had become everything I'd dreamed of being when I first decided to pursue medicine. I was saving lives, advancing medical knowledge, and building a legacy that would outlast any personal drama from my past. The greatest victory hadn't been in watching my enemies fall, but in rising so far above our shared history that their actions became irrelevant to my happiness and success. I had learned that the best revenge is indeed living well, and that forgiveness, even when difficult, is ultimately liberating for everyone involved. As I pulled into the parking garage of my downtown building, I realized that I was finally ready to move forward completely. The past had taught me valuable lessons about resilience, character, and the importance of building something meaningful with your life. But it no longer defined me or limited my potential for future happiness. The story of David Coleman, betrayed husband, was over. The story of Dr. David Coleman, cardiac surgeon and healer, was just beginning. The operating room fell silent except for the steady hum of machines keeping Rebecca alive. I stood at the scrub sink, methodically washing my hands while watching her vitals on the monitor through the glass partition. Her heart rate was erratic, blood pressure dropping despite the medications coursing through her forelines. Every minute we delayed increased her chances of irreversible damage or death. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head of anesthesiology, approached me as I finished scrubbing. David, I need to ask you directly, are you absolutely certain you can maintain professional objectivity during this procedure? If there's any doubt in your mind about your ability to separate your personal history from your medical judgment, we need to discuss alternatives. I appreciated her directness. Dr. Mitchell had been briefed on the unusual circumstances surrounding this case. She was right to question whether I could perform at my highest level when operating on someone who had caused me significant personal pain. The question deserved a thoughtful answer. Sarah, I've been thinking about exactly that question since the moment I recognized her, I said, holding my hands up as a nurse helped me into my surgical gown. 3 years ago, I might not have been able to separate my emotions from my medical responsibilities, but I'm not the same person I was then. What's changed? She asked, securing my mask behind my ears. Everything, I said simply. My skills, my confidence, my understanding of what really matters. When I look at Rebecca now, I don't see the woman who betrayed me. I see a patient with a complex cardiac condition that I'm uniquely qualified to repair. That's all. Dr. Mitchell studied my face carefully. And if complications arise during surgery, if you have to make split-second decisions that could determine whether she lives or dies, then I'll make the same decisions I would make for any patient, I said. Based on medical evidence, surgical best practices, and my assessment of what gives her the highest probability of survival and recovery. I believe you, Dr. Mitchell said, but I'm going to be watching you very carefully throughout this procedure. If I see any sign that your judgment is compromised, I'll call it. I would expect nothing less, I said. As we entered the operating room, the surgical team was already in position. The perfusionist had the heart-lung bypass machine prepared and ready. The surgical technician had laid out the specialized instruments I would need for the mitral valve repair and septal defect closure. Everyone moved with the precision that comes from years of experience in high-stakes cardiac surgery. Rebecca lay unconscious on the operating table, her chest exposed and prepped for surgery. The monitors displayed her vital signs in real time, painting a picture of a cardiovascular system in severe distress. Her ejection fraction was dangerously low, indicating that her heart was pumping inefficiently. The echocardiogram showed the mitral valve leaflets flailing chaotically with each heartbeat, allowing blood to flow backward instead of forward through her circulatory system. Patient is ready for incision, Dr. Mitchell announced, checking the monitors that tracked Rebecca's anesthesia levels and vital signs. I positioned myself at the operating table, scalpel in hand, and paused for a moment to center myself mentally. This was the moment when everything would be decided, not just Rebecca's fate, but my own character. The choice I made in the next few hours would define who I had become as both a surgeon and a human being. I made the initial incision with steady, hands cutting through skin and muscle tissue to expose Rebecca's chest cavity. The familiar rhythm of surgery took over as I worked through the layers of anatomy, each cut precise and purposeful. My hands moved automatically while my mind focused entirely on the technical challenges ahead. Bovie, I said, and the electrocautery device was placed in my palm without delay. I used it to control bleeding as I continued the dissection, working toward Rebecca's heart with methodical patience. Around me, the surgical team anticipated my needs, handing me instruments and adjusting lighting without being asked. Rib spreader, I requested, and felt the heavy metal device settle into my hands. This was always the most dramatic moment of cardiac surgery, when the patient's chest was opened wide enough to expose the heart itself. I cranked the spreader slowly, watching Rebecca's ribs separate to reveal the pericardium, the thin membrane surrounding her heart. There it is, I murmured, more to myself than to anyone else. Rebecca's heart was visibly struggling, contracting irregularly and inefficiently. I could see the malformed mitral valve through the translucent pericardium, its leaflets moving in the chaotic pattern that indicated severe regurgitation. Pericardium looks normal, I announced for the surgical record. No evidence of adhesions or inflammation. Proceeding with pericardiotomy. I carefully cut through the pericardium, exposing Rebecca's heart completely. The organ that had once beaten with excitement when she saw Marcus, that had raced with adrenaline during their secret encounters, that had perhaps ached with guilt during our marriage's final months, now lay before me damaged and vulnerable. "Jesus," whispered Tom Rodriguez, the newest member of our surgical team. "I've never seen valve pathology quite like that." He was right to be impressed. Rebecca's mitral valve was a textbook example of severe prolapse with ruptured chordae tendineae. The tiny fibrous cords that normally held the valve leaflets in proper position had snapped, allowing the leaflets to flip backward into the left atrium with each heartbeat. It was the kind of case that medical students would study for years. "The good news is that the valve leaflets themselves appear structurally sound," I said, examining the tissue more closely. "This is repairable rather than requiring replacement." Dr. Mitchell monitored Rebecca's vital signs as I prepared to place her on cardiopulmonary bypass. "Pressure's dropping again," she announced. "We need to get her on the pump soon." "Agreed," I said. Heparin administered. "Full systemic anticoagulation achieved," confirmed Lisa Park, our cardiovascular perfusionist. I cannulated Rebecca's aorta and right atrium, threading the tubes that would divert her blood through the heart-lung machine during the repair. Once the bypass was established, I would stop her heart completely, working in the still, bloodless field that cardiac surgery required. "Going on pump," I announced. Bypass flow initiated. The heart-lung machine took over Rebecca's circulation, and I prepared to arrest her heart with cardioplegia solution. This was always a profound moment in cardiac surgery when a patient's life depended entirely on mechanical support and the surgeon's skill. "Aortic cross-clamp applied," I said, cutting off blood flow to Rebecca's coronary arteries, administering cardioplegia. Rebecca's heart stopped beating within seconds of receiving the high-potassium solution. The operating room became quieter, with only the rhythmic sounds of the bypass machine and ventilator breaking the silence. I now had approximately 2 hours to complete the repairs before Rebecca's heart needed to resume beating. "Opening the left atrium," I announced, making a careful incision that would give me access to the mitral valve. As the atrium opened, I could see the full extent of the damage. Several chordae tendineae had ruptured completely, and the posterior valve leaflet was flailing freely with each stroke of the bypass pump. "Wow," said Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the cardiothorac, surgery fellow observing the case. "How did this go undiagnosed for so long?" "Mitral valve prolapse often develops gradually," I explained as I worked. "Many patients have mild forms that never cause symptoms. But when chordae rupture suddenly, like during the stress of surgery, it can become life-threatening within minutes." I began the delicate process of repairing Rebecca's valve, using Gore-Tex sutures to replace the ruptured chordae tendineae. Each stitch had to be precisely placed and tensioned to restore the valve's normal geometry. To tight, and the leaflets wouldn't close properly. To loose, and the valve would continue to leak. "First neochart in place," I said, testing the tension by gently manipulating the valve leaflet. The repair was progressing well, but I still had to address the septal defect, hole in the wall between Rebecca's left and right ventricles. "Septal defect is about 2 centimeters, I observed, probing the opening with a surgical instrument. "Looks like a secundum-type atrial septal defect that was probably present since birth. Will you use a patch?" asked Dr. Hayes. "Yes, pericardial." "Patch should work perfectly for this size defect," I said, preparing the piece of tissue that would permanently seal the hole in Rebecca's heart. As I worked on the septal repair, I found myself thinking about the symbolic nature of what I was doing. I was literally mending Rebecca's broken heart, fixing defects that had existed since birth and damage that had occurred suddenly under stress. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't affect the steadiness of my hands or the precision of my technique. "Patch sutures in place," I announced after completing the septal defect repair. "Coming off cross-clamp." White. I removed the aortic cross-clamp, allowing blood to flow back into Rebecca's coronary arteries. Within moments, her heart began to contract spontaneously, resuming the rhythm that would sustain her life. "Beautiful repair," Dr. Mitchell observed, watching the echocardiogram monitor that showed Rebecca's heart function in real time. The mitral valve looks completely competent now. I watched the monitor myself, feeling a deep satisfaction as I saw Rebecca's heart beating normally for perhaps the first time in years. The valve leaflets closed crisply with each heartbeat, preventing the backward flow that had been threatening her life. The septal defect was completely sealed, eliminating the abnormal communication between her heart chambers. "Coming off bypass," I announced as Lisa gradually weaned Rebecca from the heart-lung machine. "Heart rhythm looks excellent." Rebecca's own heart took over her circulation smoothly, pumping efficiently without the mechanical support she depended on during the repair. Her blood pressure stabilized, and her cardiac output improved dramatically as the repaired valve restored normal blood flow through her cardiovascular system. "Temporary pacing wires in place," I said, threading thin electrical leads onto Rebecca's heart that could stimulate normal rhythm if needed during her recovery. Chest tubes positioned. Final stages of surgery involved closing Rebecca's chest, a process that was technically straightforward but required attention to detail to ensure proper healing. I placed multiple layers of sutures to bring her sternum back together, then closed the muscle and skin layers with meticulous technique. "Final sponge and instrument count correct," announced Maria Santos, our lead surgical technician. "Surgery complete," I said, stepping back from the operating table. Total bypass time was 93 minutes. Cross-clamp time was 76 minutes. Excellent repair of mitral valve prolapse with chordal replacement and patch closure of atrial septal defect. Dr. Mitchell began the process of waking Rebecca from anesthesia as the rest of the surgical team prepared to transfer her to the cardiac intensive care unit. I remained at her bedside, monitoring her vital signs and neurological responses as she slowly regained consciousness. "Rebecca," I said softly as her eyes began to flutter open, "the surgery is over." Everything went perfectly. She looked at me with confusion at first, then recognition, then what appeared to be gratitude mixed with something more complex. "David?" she whispered through her breathing tube. "Don't try to talk yet," I said. "The breathing tube will be removed in a few hours once you're fully awake. Your heart is working perfectly now." As Rebecca was wheeled to the ICU, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with having used my skills to save a life. The man I'd become was capable of separating personal history from professional responsibility, of choosing healing over hatred, of demonstrating that excellence in one's chosen field was the ultimate victory over those who had doubted or betrayed you. The surgery had been flawless, but more importantly, it had proven to myself and everyone involved that I had grown beyond the pain and anger that had once consumed me. I had become exactly the kind of surgeon and person I'd always aspired to be. 3 weeks after Rebecca's surgery, I was completing my evening rounds when my pager buzzed with an urgent message. "Emergency department needed immediate cardiac surgery consultation for a 45-year-old male presenting with acute chest pain and cardiogenic shock." I made my way downstairs, reviewing the preliminary information that had been transmitted to my phone. The patient's name stopped me cold, Marcus Chen, when I arrived at the emergency department. I found Marcus on a gurney in Trauma Bay 2, conscious but clearly in severe distress. His face was gray with pain, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. The cardiac monitor showed dangerous arrhythmias, and his blood pressure was barely maintaining perfusion to his vital organs. Dr. Angela Torres, the attending emergency physician, briefed me quickly. "Massive anterior wall myocardial infarction. Came in about 30 minutes ago complaining of crushing chest pain that started during his drive home from work. Initial EKG shows complete occlusion of the left anterior descending artery. He's going to need emergency angioplasty or bypass surgery." I approached Marcus's bedside, noting how much he'd deteriorated since I'd last seen him 3 weeks earlier. The stress of Rebecca's medical crisis, combined with their ongoing financial struggles, had clearly taken a toll on his health. "Marcus, I'm Dr. Coleman. Can you tell me about your symptoms?" Marcus looked up at me with eyes that reflected both physical pain and emotional defeat. "David," he said weakly, "the chest pain started about an hour ago. Feels like someone's sitting on my chest. My left arm is numb. Any history of heart disease? I asked, checking his pulse and examining the monitors displaying his vital signs. My father died of a heart attack at 52, Marcus said. I've been on blood pressure medication for the past 2 years, but I haven't been great about taking it regularly. Dr. Torres handed me Marcus's EKG results, and the findings were unambiguous. He was having what we called the widowmaker, a complete blockage of the left anterior, descending artery that supplied blood to the largest portion of his heart, muscle. Without immediate intervention, Marcus would die within hours. We need to get him to the cardiac catheterization lab immediately, I told Dr. Torres. Call interventional cardiology and tell them we're coming up with a STEMI alert. As the nursing staff prepared Marcus for transport, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange symmetry of the situation. 3 weeks ago, I'd saved Rebecca's life when she'd suffered a heart attack. Now Marcus was facing a similar crisis, and once again, I was the only cardiac surgeon immediately available to help. The cardiac catheterization procedure revealed the full extent of Marcus's coronary artery disease. The left anterior descending artery was completely blocked by a massive clot. But more concerning was the discovery that his right coronary artery also had significant stenosis. Marcus needed emergency bypass surgery, not just angioplasty. Dr. Coleman, said Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the interventional cardiologist. I can try to open the lad with a stent, but given the extent of disease in his other vessels, he's really going to need surgical revascularization for optimal long-term outcomes. I studied Marcus's coronary angiogram, noting the complex pattern of blockages that would require multiple bypass grafts. You're right, this is a surgical case. How's his hemodynamic status? Borderline. He's on maximum pressor support, but his cardiac output is severely compromised. If we're going to operate, it needs to be tonight. I made the decision to proceed with emergency coronary artery bypass surgery, knowing that Marcus's survival depended on restoring blood flow to his heart muscle as quickly as possible. The irony of operating on both Rebecca and Marcus within a month of each other wasn't lost on me, but my focus remained entirely on the medical challenges at hand. The surgery took 5 hours and required 4 bypass grafts to restore adequate blood flow to Marcus's heart. Unlike Rebecca's procedure, which had been technically challenging but relatively routine, Marcus's surgery was complicated by his poor cardiac function and the extensive nature of his coronary artery disease. During the procedure, I found myself thinking about the man lying unconscious on my operating table. Marcus had made serious mistakes in his personal and professional life, but he was also someone's husband, someone's colleague, someone who had value beyond his worst decisions. As I sutured each bypass graft into place, I was reminded that healing doesn't require liking or forgiving someone. It simply requires recognizing their humanity. Marcus's recovery was more difficult than Rebecca's had been. He spent 4 days in the cardiac intensive care unit, battling complications including irregular heart rhythms and fluid retention. During that time, Rebecca visited him daily, sitting by his bedside and reading to him when he was unconscious. On the 5th day after surgery, when Marcus was finally stable enough for a normal conversation, I made my final rounds to check on his progress. He was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert, with Rebecca beside him holding his hand. Dr. Coleman, Marcus said as I entered his room. Rebecca told me you performed my surgery. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, I replied, checking his incision and reviewing his cardiac rehabilitation plan. Your recovery is progressing well. You should be able to go home in a few days. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at me. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. When you were operating on me, when my life was in your hands, did you ever consider just letting me die? The question hung in the air between us. Rebecca looked shocked that Marcus had asked it so directly, but I appreciated his honesty. No, I said simply. That thought never crossed my mind. When I'm in the operating room, I'm not David Coleman, the man whose wife you stole. Dr. Coleman, a cardiac surgeon whose job is to save lives. That's who I chose to become. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm grateful for that choice. And I want you to know that I understand now what Rebecca and I threw away when we betrayed you. It's not just your trust, but the chance to know the man you've become. Over the following weeks, As both Rebecca and Marcus recovered from their surgeries, I occasionally encountered them during follow-up appointments. They had decided to remain married, apparently finding that their shared medical crises had reminded them of what they still valued in each other. Rebecca returned to work part-time at a nonprofit clinic, using her pharmaceutical industry experience to help underserved patients access cardiac medications. Marcus took a position teaching at a community college, sharing his medical knowledge with future healthcare workers rather than practicing clinical medicine. 6 months later, I received an invitation to a small dinner party at their modest apartment. The invitation included a handwritten note from Rebecca. We wanted to thank the man who gave us both a second chance at life and the opportunity to become better people. I didn't attend the dinner, but I appreciated the gesture. My relationship with Rebecca and Marcus would never be friendship, but it had evolved into something I could live with. Mutual respect between people who had all grown beyond their worst moments. A year after their surgeries, I was promoted to Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery at Swedish Medical Center. During my acceptance speech to the hospital board, I spoke about the importance of separating personal emotions from professional responsibilities, and how the greatest victories in medicine come not from defeating enemies, but from saving lives regardless of personal history. That evening, as I looked out from my office window at the Seattle skyline, I realized that my journey from betrayed husband to accomplished surgeon was complete. I had built a career and a reputation based on excellence, integrity, and the ability to heal rather than harm. The revenge I'd once fantasized about had been unnecessary. Living well, becoming the best version of myself. And choosing compassion over vengeance had been far more satisfying than any elaborate scheme. Rebecca and Marcus had faced the natural consequences of their choices, but they had also been given the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. In saving their lives, I had proven to myself that I was capable of rising above the pain they had caused me. The man who had discovered his wife's affair 3 years earlier was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful. I had learned that true victory doesn't come from watching your enemies fall, but from becoming someone whose success and character render their opinions irrelevant. As I turned off the lights in my office and headed home to my downtown penthouse, I felt a profound sense of peace. The story of betrayal and revenge was over. The story of healing and redemption would continue for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.